Good morning. For everybody who doesn't know me, which I think is nobody at this point, but I'm Marian Bittler, and I'm a professor of economics and interim director of the Institute for Social Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our second ISS noon lecture of the quarter. This lecture series illuminates topical cutting-edge social sciences research taking place on our campus and offers faculty, especially junior faculty or new faculty in the university, an opportunity to present their work to an interdisciplinary audience. This is one of many things that we're doing, and if you want to know more about it, sign up for our mailing list, look at our webpage, look at Twitter, look at the other places, okay? Instagram, YouTube, things I don't use, like Instagram. And we have, before I introduce our speaker, we have two other noon lectures taking place this fall. On November 17th, together with HIA, we'll be hearing from Associate Professor of Anthropology, Randy Haas. And on November 27th, Associate Professor of Communication, Magdalena Wojciech, will deliver our final noon lecture of the quarter. I hope you'll come to some of these as well and invite your students personally, maybe. So joining us today is Assistant Professor of Political Science, Lauren Young. Dr. Young's research aims to understand how individuals make decisions when faced with a threat of political violence. Her book project uses data from Zimbabwe to investigate how citizens make decisions about participation in pro-democracy dissent in autocratic regimes. Her research draws on theory from psychology and behavioral economics to generate new predictions about political preferences and behavior in contexts affected by violence and other forms of coercion. Methodologically, she applies a mix of experimental research designs, quantitative historical analysis, and in-depth qualitative interviews. She's involved in ongoing research projects in Eastern Europe, Haiti, Kenya, the US, and Mexico. As she presents a lecture entitled Anger and Support for Punitive Justice in Mexico's Drug War, which she told me is new work, so that's pretty exciting. Please join me in welcoming Lauren Young.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for making time for this today. So this is joint work with one of our other colleagues here at UC Davis, and also with Thomas Zaitzoff, who's an assistant professor at American University. And the motivation for this project is that in many cases, there's evidence that there is strong popular support for criminal justice policies that are kind of harshly punitive and sometimes even illegal or extrajudicial. So one example of this that's been in the news recently is the Philippines, where President Rodrigo Duterte has made outrageous claims of personally killing criminals and is actually thought to have killed as many as 7,000 people using death squads, and remains extraordinarily popular. Another example that I'm going to be talking about today is Mexico, where after many years of extraordinarily harsh narco-trafficking-related violence, groups that are that are protecting communities or claiming to protect communities called autodefensas have sprung up and are similarly shown in national polls to be quite popular. Despite concerns that they're also getting involved in narco-trafficking themselves. And on the flip side of this, there are many cases, this is a picture just from over in Richmond, there are many cases of policies that are kind of more rehabilitative. So this is a picture from a program where people suspected of being engaged in gangs in Richmond were given a bundle of different resources, including cash payments, in order to try to induce them not to participate anymore in crime. And programs like this are often incredibly unpopular, even in cases where there is some evidence that they're actually making a difference in making people safer and reducing violence and crime. So, why is there this kind of culture of rough justice, or why are harsh policies so popular? Well, less harsh but potentially effective policies remain very, very unpopular. So I'm going to kind of lay out two competing theories around this. And the first one focused really on low capacity states or high corruption states like Mexico, is that vigilante violence or kind of harsh extrajudicial criminal justice policy is kind of a best response that people have in situations of extreme insecurity. So some of these studies have been done in places like Pakistan or Ghana, or even in Mexico, the case that I'm talking about, and have basically argued that when the police are terrible, when violence is very high, all that people can do is try to kind of band together at the community level and threaten criminals with extreme violence in order to induce them not to continue to perpetrate crime. An alternative argument that I'm going to be making today is that people support these harsh policies as part of an emotional reaction that they have in the face of certain types of violence. And so in this argument, violence causes people to experience things like anger and fear that in the short term shift their preferences so that they no longer care as much about their own security and care a lot about engaging in kind of harsh punishments for people who they perceive have wronged them. And ultimately, for the political scientists in the room, I think this ties into a broader debate about how people end up in kind of suboptimal conflict equilibria, right? So there is kind of some rational choice theory that would say that, violence or conflict is never in anyone's interest because it's destructive. So you can, in most cases, come up with some kind of negotiated solution to violence. And I think that these short-term emotional reactions, more generally, outside of just the criminal justice context, can help explain why, people themselves may participate in speeding towards a solution of greater insecurity. Because their preferences kind of get scrambled in the short term when they're in these extreme situations. So I've kind of tried to pitch you on the theoretical relevance of this project, but I don't want to downplay the kind of human relevance. So in a number of countries, particularly in Central and Latin America, there are just enormous amounts of homicides that rival even the level of homicides that kind of countries in the midst of civil war are experiencing. So this is some opinion data from a recent Gallup poll, where you can basically see that in countries affected by organized crime like Mexico, South Africa, and El Salvador, the level of safety that people feel rivals that of countries like Afghanistan and Syria, which we perceive, which are in the midst of civil wars and which we perceive as some of the most dangerous places in the world. Right? And this kind of level of both real and perceived insecurity has massive implications for how people live their lives. So this is a question that kind of has policy relevance and also just kind of a human relevance as well. So to give you an overview of the rest of the talk, I'm going to first give more details on the theoretical framework, so lay out an argument that citizens value multiple things when they come up with their preferences, or in their preferences for criminal justice policy, and an argument for how emotions might cause shifts between these different priorities that people hold in the short term. I'll then talk about the research design that we used. So this is a 3-part study where we use both a correlational analysis and then 2 survey experimental analyses that we implemented in a survey of about 1,200 people in Western Mexico. And to give you a preview of the findings, I'm going to argue, maybe unsurprisingly by this point in the talk, that people exposed to violence are more likely to prefer harsh and extrajudicial criminal justice policy. This seems to be driven by anger responses that people have. And in the final kind of part of the study, we disaggregate different components of crimes, particularly violent crimes, to try to figure out exactly what type of violence is most likely to spur these anger responses. And our main finding in this section is that crimes against kind of innocent victims, so not narco-traffickers and not people like the police or the military who are fighting the narco-traffickers, but grandmothers and students and things like that, are most likely to create support for harsh and extrajudicial punishments. And please feel free to interrupt me if you guys have questions or comments at any point. Okay, so the theoretical framework. So the first kind of tenet or assumption of our theoretical framework is that citizens have multiple priorities in justice policy, including retribution, or that criminals get kind of their just desserts, effectiveness in preventing future crimes, so kind of a utilitarian type of priority, and also people value legality in criminal justice policy, or a sense of procedural fairness in a more general sense. And these things are not always perceived as kind of being a cohesive set by citizens, right? These sometimes come into conflict. And so this raises the question of when citizens will prefer one of these over another. And what we argue, based on literature mostly in psychology, is that anger can cause shifts between which of these priorities people, or which of these tenets people will give first priority to in forming their actual preferences over policy. And some of the literature that we use to make this prediction comes from cognitive appraisal theory. So people have argued that anger causes people to actually perceive those who they see who have wronged them as having stronger or being more culpable for the wrongs that they have faced. So this is a kind of attribution that then leads them to conclude that a harsh punishment is more justified. There's also a literature more from behavioral economics about third-party punishment, establishing that people are willing often to pay to punish someone who they believe has wronged them, even when they will not get any kind of utility out of it in the end. So it's kind of the idea that there's a taste for punishment in a range of different settings. And then there's been some work in political psychology in the US looking at when different emotions will lead to actual policy shifts or shifts in policy preferences. So some of this work has looked at, for example, reactions to 9/11 and different and also kind of welfare policy. But we're extending this outside of the US, first of all, and also looking at criminal justice policy. So there's a lot of evidence about anger. Yeah?
Can I ask a question? So when thinking about this in this context, like you say that there's the people are sort of valuing these different things, but doesn't it also matter how they perceive the effectiveness and what they know about it and what they think is happening in terms of fairness and all of that?
Absolutely.
Are you going to be able to take that into account?
So we try to take that into account in the experimental designs. In reality, it's hard to take that into account. But in the correlational analysis, I will kind of try to pick that apart empirically, because you don't necessarily expect that someone just being exposed to violence will, for some reason, change their perception of what type of policy is effective. So that could be endogenous to the emotional reaction, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, that is kind of a core design challenge that we try to address primarily through these survey experiments that we're going to run, or that we have run. So I've described the kind of existing literature on anger and punishment preferences as being pretty clear. On the other hand, the literature on exposure to violence has shown fairly mixed effects. So some research on exposure to violence suggests that it increases people's preferences for punishment or aggressive policies, but other research shows that it may decrease it. And this is kind of beyond the scope of this project, but part of the reason for this diversity in findings may be that different types of violence are causing different emotional reactions, or that just different cases may cause different things. So this is kind of a more substantive literature that we're trying to add to as well. So this is the kind of causal chain that we're proposing. First, that exposure to violence causes increases in anger and the closely related concept of moral outrage, and this causes increases in support for harsh and extrajudicial criminal justice policy. So the research design, as I mentioned, has 3 different parts. So in the first part, the driving research question is there a real-world relationship between violence, anger, and support for harsh vigilante justice? So here we're using a correlational analysis looking across the people in our 1,200-person sample. In the second study, we're using an experimental design to try to identify whether specifically violence that kind of causes moral outrage is going to cause people to increase both their anger and also their preferences for harsh and extrajudicial punishments. And then finally, in the third study, we look at, this is also a survey experiment, and we look at a range of about 125 different crime scenarios where we randomize different aspects of the scenarios to try to identify specific characteristics of violence that are most likely to induce this kind of reaction. And just as a plug, we pre-registered these hypotheses and also the way that we were going to do the analysis to try to prevent the risk of phishing and getting false positives. Okay, so as I mentioned, the case that we're looking at is Western Mexico. Sorry, this is, I think, pretty low resolution, but we surveyed people, a representative sample of 4 states in Western Mexico, which we essentially chose because it has a mix of different levels of exposure to violence and also different levels of exposure to vigilantes in the past. And so this is a map of just one of the 4 states where we did the survey. And to give you a little bit of context, this state of Michoacan is a state where it's kind of the heart of the autodefensa vigilante movement that I mentioned. And so the areas in kind of red and green are areas that, as of, I think this was maybe a map from 2014 or 15, that had autodefensa groups in those municipalities at the time of this report that was put out by the Mexican government. I mentioned already that there are national polls showing pretty high support for this vigilante movement, and also extraordinarily high support for harsher punishments, even when they're kind of illegal or extrajudicial.
Sorry, what's the difference between red and green?
Yeah, so the green groups are just given a slightly different status. They're called like communal police, and they're not part of like the broader autodefensa network, but it's a similar idea of kind of a self-defense group at the community level. So as I mentioned, our sampling strategy, well, these are the states in Western Mexico in a broader map of the country, and then these areas in green are the specific electoral areas that we sampled. The sampling strategy we used created 12 different strata. So we stratified based on Michoacan versus the other 3 states, vigilante group presence, and the homicide rate in order to get kind of a balanced mix of those variables. And then we took a random sample of people from those selected electoral areas. And so, well, this is a little bit technical, but we can analyze this data with sampling weights and without. The results really don't change, but you should think of this as kind of a representative sample. Okay, so just to show you a little bit of descriptive data from this analysis, or from this sample, this is a plot of 5 different types of violence that we asked people about indirectly. Each of these dots represents one electoral area. So we had in total 120 different electoral areas that we sampled from, and each of these dots is based on about 10 survey responses. And so essentially what you can see, and we asked people about violence indirectly in order to kind of preserve their security primarily. We took a number of steps that I'm happy to talk about in Q&A in order to make sure that this study didn't actually endanger anyone in the process of doing it. And one of the, methods that we had to use was to ask people indirectly so that they couldn't be punished, post-survey for having revealed actual information about violence that they had experienced. So we asked people, how likely is it that someone in your community would have experienced abduction, assault, extortion, protection, or being threatened with a weapon in the past 30 days? And so these are just community averages. So you can see, in some communities, the average response is, this is somewhat likely. In others, happily, it's not at all. So there's a wide range of experiences with violence in the communities that we surveyed, which is good because we need that for the analysis. There's also a wide range of experience wide range of exposure to different types of armed groups. So we asked people about the presence of police, army, narco-traffickers, and autodefensas. And you can see not all of the communities have autodefensas. In Michoacan, as expected, there's a higher rate of people saying that the autodefensas are very likely to be present in their community than in the other states. And there's a wide range also of police, army, and narco-trafficker presence.
So what does the proportion stand for? Is the proportion answering
So this
some
is
response
also,
on a question or what?
yeah, this is the proportion of people who said, yes, it's likely that these groups are present in our community. Yeah, or present in a community like ours. This is another question we asked indirectly to preserve people's security.
Within the neighborhoods or the sampling electoral districts, was there a lot of variation in the answers you got?
That's a
Is there
good
needs,
question. I have not checked that specifically, but yeah, we could put little confidence intervals on each of these.
Or, just to see if you're getting consistent answers. right?
Absolutely, yeah. So we did do, especially on the violence, we did a couple of kind of reality checks. There is not a lot of high quality data on violence in these communities at such a local level. But we do see, for example, at the state level, a strong relationship between states where we know that there's more violence and the response is here. And we also see, we did a couple questions where we asked both directly and indirectly for like lower level types of violence, and we see very strong correlations there. So that's kind of how we validated this particular type of measurement.
So on that slide, would one of the takeaway points be, given that the medians are so low, that everyone just perceives each of these groups as being in low prevalence? I mean, because of purport. Is that how I would interpret that?
So
about 30% perceived police presence? Is that?
yeah, so that would be in the last, this is also asked in the last 30 days, I believe. So yeah, I mean, I guess you could say, it depends what your priors are for how frequently the police or the army would be going into these communities. A lot of these are kind of small neighborhoods. Just, from kind of my own priors, I think I was a little surprised that the army is so prevalent in these areas, or is perceived as being so prevalent. But yeah, it may be lower than expected for the police. I don't know. You also know this area quite well, so maybe you had different priors here.
Well, I was just thinking about it in terms of people have really bad ability at guessing sizes of other populations, but usually they overstate the size of like threatening populations, and so the fact that like narcos are really low, the presence of the police is relatively low, may convey like some insecurity, is that they see themselves as being less protected.
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. Yeah.
What do you mean?
It's also, no, that's a good point. We should think more, we don't actually use this variable. I think we spend a lot more time trying to think about how to validate the violence data. But I think it's a very good point that some of this might, that there might be systematic deviations between perception of where these groups are and where they actually are. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to show you now some results from the correlational analysis. So the independent variable that we're looking at here is an index based on just exposure to, or indirect measurement of exposure to all of these 5 different measures of violence that I showed you initially. And the dependent variables that I'm going to show you are first a harsh punishment index. So this is an index based on 2 questions, one of which asks about support for the death penalty, which was kind of nullified in Mexico recently. So that's whether people want to bring it back. And a second question, which asks whether they oppose paying narcos to stop perpetrating crime. And then the second index that I'll show you is a pro-vigilante index. So this is an index of 3 questions that ask about support for auto defenses, different vigilante groups, and lynching of criminals. And then I'll show you results for 3 outcome variables or dependent variables that we see as part of the mechanism linking violence to these criminal justice preferences. So an anger index, a blame index, and a punitiveness index, looking at these different attributions and kind of a more fundamental type of preference that should precede people's specific policy preferences. and Chris, I know you're going to ask this question. These indices are mean effects indices. So if you have ideas, I'd love to talk about better ways to pull this together.
Can I, so I don't want to skip ahead, like do they correlate pretty highly, the indices with each other?
Yeah, I have that in some of the backup slides. They don't correlate as strongly as we would think. And actually, our main results are based mostly on 3 out of 5 of these. So they're being driven by movement on 3 out of 5 of these outcomes. So that's something we didn't expect when we pre-registered, but we kind of continue to analyze them as indices because that's what we committed to before we got the data. Yeah. Okay, so one thing I just want to show you before the results is that there is a large amount of variation in people's preferences for, in this case, harsh policy. So about a third of the sample agrees or strongly agrees that the death penalty should be brought back. And similarly, that there's a lot of variation on the need or the perceived need for armed groups outside of the government. Again, it's about a third of the sample that thinks that those groups are necessary. And what we see in the correlational study is that there are small but fairly strong or robust relationships between exposure to violence on this perceived violence index and support for pro-vigilante policies and harsh punishment policies, as well as frequency of experiencing anger and attributions of blame and punitiveness. Okay. So at a just correlational level, we can't really say these are causal relationships, but there is some evidence suggesting that there is a real-world relationship going on here. So the second study asks or tries to identify whether outrageous violence has a causal effect on support for harsher vigilante punishments. And for this study, we asked people about 3 different scenarios. So I'm getting a little bit low on time, so I won't read through all of these, but these scenarios, basically in the control version or the placebo version, it's a form of violence that is bad, but not kind of breaking a moral tenet or a commonly held norm. So in the case of scenario 1, there's a situation where a narco gang controls the town and they're notorious for abusing and exploiting the local population. That's the placebo version. In the outrageous version, they're notorious for abusing and exploiting children under the age of 10. Right, so this kind of violates a very clear social norm. And then people are given 2 different possible outcomes and asked to choose between these 2 choices. One, which is kind of legal, so the gang members are arrested and put on trial for their crimes, and one which is extrajudicial and much harsher. So the narco gang members are killed by locals in the town square. And I'm going to show you results that break these down, because actually, in our main results in the paper, and what we pre-registered was that we would analyze these all together. But we actually found pretty different results across the 3 different scenarios. So some of them were better at inducing outrage than others were. But what you can see first is that across the different scenarios, there's about a 10 to, I think the max is maybe 18% of the sample that prefers the harsh vigilante solution. So again, this is kind of fairly strong support for even very extreme examples of vigilante violence. Okay, and so this is just a manipulation check where these are standardized treatment effects on 2 outcome variables of anger and fear. So we asked people, how angry would you be if this crime occurred in your community? And what you can see is that for the abusing children scenario, people were really quite angry. This is about a 0.3 standard deviation increase in anger. For the other scenarios, it didn't work as well at actually inducing moral outrage. Yeah,
Is that because the other things happen in those places? Like the decapitation happens all over the place, right? Is there a variation where stuff like that happens that could drive this?
I suspect, I think there is variation. I think you're right that maybe the abusing children scenario is a little bit more like far-fetched, perhaps. So maybe
Just
people are
not
less
common.
alert to it. Yeah. That's possible. So when I get to study 3, that's part of the reason why we designed study 3, to be able to identify the characteristics of these scenarios that are driving differences like this. Here it's hard to say because a lot of things are changing across the 3 scenarios.
What's this sort of average sizes for treatment and control for each study? Like what's the N?
Oh, so the N of each of these is basically 600. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'll show you results for all 3 of these, but keep in mind 2 of these basically didn't, to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, pass the manipulation check. So the main kind of outcomes that we should be looking at are for the first scenario. And so what you see in the first scenario is that there are effects on which of the different outcomes is preferred, which is perceived as more just, and which is perceived as more effective. So Marian, this kind of gets to your question about whether these are endogenous views of what actually works at preventing violence. Now, we should take this with a grain of salt because the second scenario really had no effect, even though it did have a little effect on anger compared to the placebo. So these are, I think, suggestive results, but subject to caveats that maybe this isn't happening everywhere, but is happening only in some specific, maybe particularly surprising cases. Okay, and finally, the last study. So in this study, we created 125 different scenarios that were randomly assigned. So this is a factorial design. So again, our kind of main results are going to come from split samples of 5 different victims, 5 perpetrators, and 5 crimes. And in this case, everyone was given one scenario. So imagine that a grandmother has been robbed in your community by a narco. So this is a crime that, there are variations across these combinations and how likely they actually are. But we, through piloting, kind of weeded out scenarios that were perceived as particularly unlikely. And something that we did in the rest of the analysis is we actually weight the scenario by the likelihood that people estimated in the survey. So this is something that's recommended by some of the methodologists that came up with this, just in order to make this kind of experimental setting a little bit closer to the actual treatment effects that you would get in the real world. Okay, and from these scenarios, we coded 2 main independent variables. So one, which is a 3-category variable measuring innocence of victim that takes a value of -1 for narcos, 0 for soldiers, or 1 for someone like a grandmother, a small business owner, or student, and severity of crime, ranging from nonviolent crimes like robbery all the way up to violent crimes like being disappeared or killed. And we came up with these codings primarily through some qualitative kind of pre-survey fieldwork and also through 2 pilots that we did of about 120 people in each round. And again, the outcomes that we look at are very similar to the last 2 studies: emotions that people would feel, severity of the preferred punishment, and whether the punishment that they say they prefer is extrajudicial. And so what we see here, our main finding, is that crimes with innocent victims induce a huge amount of anger compared to crimes with less innocent victims. And this is primarily being driven by comparisons between narcos, which, when the victim is a narco, people basically don't care, is my interpretation of the results, to crimes where the victim is someone like a student or a grandmother. Grandmothers in particular showed a pretty strong emotional reaction. And you can also see here that crimes with innocent victims also cause people to say that they would feel more fear, but the effect size is much smaller. And actually, I should say, something that I was pretty surprised by is that the severity of the violence actually didn't seem to have a very large effect on how angry or fearful people said that they would be. So this is something that I'm not sure how to explain at this point. I think it's, perhaps like a combination of these factors might be causing specific treatment effects at a subset that we just haven't figured out yet, but that's something that we want to look at in future work. And finally, in terms of people's preferences, we, in this study, see basically no effect on when people specifically prefer an extrajudicial punishment, but we do see strong effects on all three of these characteristics that we coded on people's preferences for a harsh punishment. So interestingly, for innocence of victim, as predicted, people were angrier and also want a harsher punishment. But there's something kind of weird going on with government perpetrator. So when the perpetrator is a kind of representative of the state, people are a little bit angrier, but they also really don't want that perpetrator to be punished harshly. So again, this is something for future research. I interpret this at this point as perhaps people's logical reactions overriding their like emotional responses, but if people have ideas about what might be driving that, I would love to talk about it more. Okay. So in conclusion, the kind of overarching findings that we're taking from these three studies are, first, that exposure to violence seems to increase anger, punitiveness, and support for vigilante policies. That this seems to be driven mostly by, particularly outrageous violence, so especially when it's against people who are perceived as innocents. And this also, I didn't show you these results, but even when you ask people about kind of the principle that they would care most about in choosing a punishment, you see that you see treatment effects on these different kind of principles that people would prioritize. So there seems to be pretty clear evidence that this is, consciously causing people to make trade-offs differently between the different punishment principles that they value. As I mentioned, I think the significance of this is that it kind of sheds light on how public opinion, people themselves or citizens themselves can kind of speed along the process of eroding the rule of law, which I think is a kind of central and important question. And I think this is relevant in multiple places, including in the US, right, where we've seen a long history of support, including some that some of our colleagues have studied, for the death penalty, for deportations, when people get outraged about immigrant-led crime. And it's also particularly relevant in low-capacity states where vigilantes, actually are able to emerge, right? Okay, and that's it. Let's just say thank you, but thank you very much for your time. Yeah.
So can you interact your things?
We haven't interacted them, to some extent. So one interaction that we kind of predicted, so for study 3, you mean?
Yeah.
One interaction that we predicted and pre-registered was that severity of violence and innocence of victim might be driving some of this. We don't really find a lot of action there. So we're kind of now looking at like each of these categories to try to pick apart whether like there might be one factor in this 5-factor variable that might be driving something, but we haven't found anything conclusive yet.
I was thinking more like the government actor, if the criminal was a narco, then maybe you don't think, I don't know if the person hurt was a narco, I don't know if they were, I can't remember if they were on the list, but.
They are on the list, yeah.
Because maybe you're really happy if somebody tortures a narco, or not happy, but you're not upset by it.
Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe we should stop thinking about that particular variable as like a continuous variable and just take out narco and see how the results might change. Yeah.
Forgive me if I sound stupid, because I just got back from Australia, and so I may be asking something that you actually already answered. But so with the conjoint, is it the case that so you have these 125 different scenarios? So was the intent of the study to see if there's like a certain constellation of factors that when you put all these things together, there's a certain kind of profile that really pushes, and then but it sounds like what you find is that the main thing that's just driving this is just innocence.
Yeah.
So this kind of relates to your question a bit. So the other factors are less important, Like, in other words, once you just put innocence in there, it just trumps everything else in the study?
That's, I mean, yeah, I think that's one takeaway, especially on the emotional reactions that people have. In terms of preferences, I think it does make sense to try to disaggregate this a bit more to figure out why we're getting some of the unexpected results. The main reason that we the way we're analyzing this conjoint is a little bit unusual, I think, because we have kind of pre-coded the different categories and we're not just analyzing them as factors. And we did that largely to avoid having, you know, a large number of coefficients, which like we thought could produce some false positives and also just make it hard to interpret. But yeah, I think given that we have some kind of odd results on the government perpetrator especially, we should disaggregate it more. And actually what you see on the government perpetrator is that when you disaggregate it, most of this effect is being driven by narcos compared to the rest of the actors. So like auto defenses versus the government, there's not a huge difference in how people think they should be punished, but it's just that the support for harsh punishments for narcos is so strong that that's also kind of overriding everything else.
And unrelated to that, because so support for some of this justice, I guess, so the reason you're doing Mexico is because Mexico has like one of the highest crime rates in the world, right? And so people are sort of ex ante exposed to really bad things pretty commonly. So I was actually surprised that the proportion of people supporting, just in the observational data, these extreme punitive measures was lower than what I would have expected. Like, so on average, like around 18%. Did that surprise you? Did you guys expect that to be higher? Like I figured if we asked that to Texans, we'd probably get a higher number than 18%.
Yeah. So my co-author starts this with a Willie Nelson quote about support for vigilante violence from Texas. But yeah, we found, so here support for these forms of extrajudicial punishments is fairly low. I think it's because we wrote these as pretty extreme cases, right? So it's written as like attacking the mayor and burning his house down, killed by auto defenses, it's like 18%. But when you actually get to like support for the death penalty or, support for armed groups outside of government, it's more like 30-some% of the sample that support this, which is a little lower than some of the other national surveys that we've seen. But interestingly enough, in Michoacan, support for the kind of pro-vigilante policies was lower than in some of the other states that have experienced higher violence recently. So I think part of this might be that, after having some experience with these groups and kind of seeing actually that some of them have gotten involved in narco trafficking themselves, support has dropped from previous surveys. Yeah.
In the third research design, you said you weighted the things by their likelihood. Was that likelihood in the community or likelihood of the actual scenario ever happening? Because it seems like the community effect might matter a little bit. Like if a grandmother got, robbed in a very rich, nonviolent community, it might be scarier than if it happened somewhere else.
That's a great point. We calculated the weights just across the entire sample. We could try calculating them at the community level. I'd have to think more methodologically about how to do that because we obviously didn't ask about each of the 125 scenarios in each community, so I'm not sure we would actually have the power to do that. Like, it would be driven by basically one person's opinion. But yeah, maybe that's something else that we should check. I should say the likelihood weights that we do use, there's not a huge variation in them, so they don't really change the results. The main results are all kind of consistent whether the sample is weighted by this likelihood or not. So my prior would be that even more specific weights might not change the results, but could be really interesting to look at. Yeah.
China, theoretical follow-up to Heather's question. So you're putting a lot of weight on the argument that this is an emotional response. I mean, so one counter-argument might be that it's concerned about the likelihood that this might happen to me or my family. And so it's not necessarily an emotional response, it's a rational calculation about the probability of it happening to me. So that's what I was wondering if you had any information on the data on the communities they're in or their background or...
Yeah, so I think that's one reason why we wanted to look at this with these experiments rather than, just looking correlationally at this. And I think that's a major concern with the first study that, in places where people are angrier about this, they also are just at a higher risk and so, see it as reasonably more necessary. What we tried to do in the experiments is, first kind of like cut down the link between the severity of the crime that people are exposed to and their personal characteristics. But, there could still be some kind of rational calculation going on. Another design that we tried in piloting is something similar to like my job market paper, where you actually induce an emotion, and I think that's a cleaner way of looking specifically at whether the emotion is kind of causing these shifts in preferences. Interestingly, our survey team just didn't feel that that was safe in this context. So they felt like going into the heart of the Vigilante movement and trying to make people angry was unreasonable, which we quickly agreed with. But yeah, that is something that we're kind of thinking about different ways to address in future work.
I actually think there's a lot to what you're saying. I saw the president's tweet yesterday about calling for the death penalty.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
An emotional person to begin with, but.
Yeah. So I think our argument kind of rests on the assumption that whether narco traffickers are abusing the local population or children under the age of 10, there's no kind of rational reason why you would want an extrajudicial policy for one and a legal policy for the other. That's, something that you can quibble with, but I think it's a reasonable assumption.
How big are the auto defense groups? And did you try to drop the people who might have actually participated in them? Maybe they have a different view about this stuff.
That's a good question. We frankly did not think about that. We did consider kind of the probability for safety reasons that one of our surveyors would be interviewing either a narco trafficker or an auto defensa. We couldn't really ask them, but yeah, maybe that's something that we should think about kind of putting bounds on. So if we might assume that there's a certain proportion of the sample that is in one of those
groups. You could look at people you think aren't going to be in the groups.
Yeah.
Like older women.
Yeah. Back to the grandmothers. Yeah. That's a really good idea. We haven't looked much at kind of heterogeneous effects by demographics, but that would make a lot of sense.
Any other questions?
I had one that I was curious if you had toyed around at all with. So the options now are, the police come in, apprehend them, and they're tried and found guilty and sentenced, and they're roughed up by a local mob. Was there any case in which it was they were apprehended and tried but acquitted, or they're dragged to their death, by a mob?
Yeah.
So kind of really giving them the hard civil liberties test of just how far are they willing to, will they actually stomach an acquittal or a failure to arrest versus just a violent mob?
Yeah. So one of the questions in our extrajudicial policy index asks exactly that. It's phrased as something like, would you rather see a criminal go on trial and be set free on a technicality or lynched in the town square? And we I can't remember the raw number there. I want to say it was something like a third of the sample. Actually, I don't want to say that because I can't remember it precisely. But we did ask that, and I'm happy to send you that number. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious if that would have any more, the suddenly like fear comes more into play, like in a case like that versus, I'm not thinking something like the OJ
interesting.
trial or something, like if the options were, he's tried and found guilty versus, executed by a mob. Like even very conservative people are going to agree with that. But then it gets to be a harder test when the scenarios are, what actually happened versus vigilante justice.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And it sounds like you're also thinking of a scenario where the future danger to the respondent is really shut down. So
Right.
yeah, so like, is there an increase in the taste for punishment, even if we can kind of manipulate the potential effectiveness? Which maybe I'm extrapolating too far from your question, but
No,
I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
Right, or what if you're worried that the criminal justice system's on the tank?
Mhm.
As part of the narcos.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think we kind of see that as like highly endogenous to the views that people have. But yeah, we do ask some questions about people's perceptions of corruption and things like that. So we could look at, for example, even for people who have very low corruption perceptions, does this effect still hold? That could be a nice, check.
Okay, that's all. Thank you, Lauren, for this interesting talk.